The tradition, the suspense, the race. Here's your chance to experience the Kentucky Derby firsthand. Rocket Mortgage is giving away 20 VIP trips to Churchill Downs to witness the Kentucky Derby. And one lucky winner will receive $250,000 toward a new home or pay off their mortgage. Enter today at homestretchsweepstakes.com.
No purchase necessary. 21 years or older. Ends in April 7, 2019. Equal housing lender licensed in all 50 states. NMLS number 3030.
And yes, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient, still searching for the First Amendment wherever it is in Cranston, Rhode Island. You can be found on Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, Coalition_radio at the mighty Twitter. Yes, that's our dulcet tunes of our new theme song. Yes, somewhere in Cranston.
Michael Gates in the Cranston Police Criminal Investigation Unit. Can you give me a call back, please, on my cell phone within the next half hour? My night is coming to an end, and I need to speak to you. What you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you? Bad boys, bad boys.
Oh, Dave.
What am I going to do? Oh boy. Here, this is my next one. I'm moving up the ladder here at the Cranston PD. So, what happened to the captain? Oh, there he is. There's the captain.
I know you received a molestation from Sergeant Gates. He's off today. If you can please give me a call back at 477-5143. Just so I can verify any conversations you had with Mayor Fung last night. And again, 477-5143. Thank you so much for returning my call.
Dave, what are you going to? What are we going to do with you, Dave?
Well, I know the first thing I did was call Kate Nagel over at GoLocalProv, and then I called the lawyer.
Right. Wait, of course, that's an interesting order, but who accomplished more for us this week than the goddess of alternative media, Kate Nagel, GoLocalProv.com, our friends and allies in Indie Media here in Little Rhody, almost our only ally here, it would seem.
Yeah. I've been getting beat up pretty good on the comment sections of a lot of stories and Facebook pages.
So social media has been interesting for us this week. Folks, if you're dialing in and you haven't heard about this controversy, the We're Not Listening tour that's been conducted across the state of Rhode Island by the fine folks who would bring you the Providence Stadium for the Pawtucket Red Sox landed this week, as it were, with the troops and all, in the Cranston Public Library. Now, let's remember, Cranston Public Library, that is funded by your tax dollars in mind, both on a federal and state and local level. Joined, of course, with the esteemed Dr. Steinberg, who really, really desperately, because if you look at the scores, if you look at the standings, and you look at social media this week, really needs to get back to dentistry, because the baseball thing ain't working out for you. Doc,
nor is the PR side job at this point.
Doc, think implants, think LASIK, whatever you got to do.
Teeth whitening, bleaching.
Right. Okay, please, for the love of God. Anyway, so, there they were in the Cranston Public Library, and what started out as a remarkably civil, I guess, give and take sessions a few weeks ago between members of the Paw Sox and members of the, the tax-paying public, the ones who you're asking to subsidize your little Fenway fantasy, have devolved, and I use the word devolved intentionally, into really the true epitome of a dog and pony show. Required sign-ins, although people, to their credit, aren't doing it. Putting down questions on cards so that they can be screened. Sid, whatever her name is, the former campaign chairman. McKenna, thank you. The former campaign chairman for the Vincent A. Buddy Cianci campaign, now being reduced to role as hall monitor, picking people out. And then, and it's on video at our website at coalitionradio.us, having, people unlike us, people mature, responsible, articulate, well-spoken individuals capable of maintaining long-term relationships, having the unmitigated wall, the sheer nerve, the balls, as they were, to ask questions and being shown the door by armed members of the Cranston Police Department. So,
for not following the rules.
Right. In Bulgaria, you shoot pictures, we shoot you. All right? So I guess I took offense at that, and so did Dave. So I drew the lucky straw. I called the city councilman in Cranston and had a remarkably civil conversation about 5 at night. Dave, what happened to you?
I called the mayor of Cranston at home at his publicly listed number, folks. Whitepages.com is where I got the number. I had a less than cordial conversation with him, at least from his end of the conversation. I tried to carry myself in as professional a manner as I could, even offered to have an off-the-record conversation with him about it, to which he replied that I was harassing him and then sicked the Cranston police on me.
Right.
So about 2 hours after I spoke to the mayor, I got a call from the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Cranston Police Department, which I was asleep at the time because, it's 11:16 at night, which is an unreasonable hour to call somebody, is it not?
Right. And by the way, I have mental images from one of the great movies of all time, and really sort of a cathartic moment in the movement. And, of course, that movie would be The Blues Brothers, when the entire law enforcement community of the state of Illinois and city of Chicago are launching themselves all over City Hall. I was picturing at this point Mayor Fung rolling out the tanks, his SWAT team, armed guards, dogs. That's the image I had.
Well, and
up 295.
Like I said in the intro, by the next morning when I received the second call from the Cranston Police Department, I had moved up the ladder and I was now being called by a captain instead of a sergeant, which I really, to be perfectly honest, I felt intimidated at that point because I didn't feel that anything that I had done rose by any level the legal definition of harassment. I called a public official at a publicly listed number. Now we can argue whether 9 p.m. is a proper hour to call somebody, but I get calls from telemarketers at 9 p.m. So
we got robocalls from the Fung campaign last year at 8, 9 o'clock at night.
That's right.
So and here's the bigger point. We were lambasted by all sorts of real and imagined Funk supporters. I say imagined because the fake Facebook IDs are out there in force, who said, wait till the next day. Now, these are the very people, by affiliating themselves with Mayor Fung, I assume, based on Mayor Fung's assertions in the past, that these folks are in fact conservative Republicans. And if there is any group that has decried the presence of an aggressive media, all right, the absence of any harsh interrogation, if you will, of our public officials, whether it be anyone from Barack Obama to Hillary Clinton, if there's anyone who has stood for the abrogation of the conventional media, it would be conservative Republicans. But
you'd think that.
You would think that. But that's okay as long as it's not on their guy.
Right.
All right? So it's great.
And I think, how did I put this to you? It boggles the mind that how quickly a group of people that clamor for answers,
right,
how quickly they turn on someone that tries to get them some.
Right. And they clamor constantly for the emergence of a new media. They decry the decline of the Urinal. They look at WJAR and say, where have you gone? There's no more investigative media. And when independent people start their own media company to fill that void, it's got to fit their storyline. I mean, the hypocrisy is astonishing. These are folks who work themselves into a figurative lather over whether or not the Obaministas held the umbrella for the Marine or not, or the Marine held the umbrella for Obama, just work themselves into a collective nervous breakdown. Yet, God forbid, when you have a clear abrogation of the First Amendment taking place in front of your eyes, it's documented on film, we're discussing it on major media, God forbid it should be an indictment of the guy you voted for. So
and then to follow that up with an intimidation of the press.
Right. So how can you be so against the I know a guy cultivation, the civilization, when in fact you know a guy and you're tweaked because we had the temerity, the sheer gall, to call up and challenge who is the mighty Oz. And it would appear that Mr. Fung has failed yet another character test in that he seems to feel he is above the fray and above question. Yet the state police at this very moment are sitting on a report soon to be disclosed, I guess at a Monday night Cranston Town Council meeting, that would point towards his misuse of the Cranston Police Department and his preferential treatment to folks involved in the ticketing scandal, which are those same people who are still obsessed with what happened in the tidal basin by Hillary Clinton in 1992, 94, who knows, all right, seem to think is trivial.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever.
Well, it's the tolerant, like you said, the tolerance for this type of behavior is there as long as it's your guy.
Right.
As long as it's my guy. I got the same reaction this week last week from the quote Democrats in this state about the legislative grants. Here's a group of people that are always clamoring for more transparency and more accountability, yet they don't see a problem with this legislative grant process somehow.
Right, where there is no accountability.
Right.
Where money, real hard dollars, in a moribund economy and a collapsing Rhode Island state government are dispensed to people based on political patronage and where you stand in Paulie Walnut's, Nikki Mattiella's food chain.
Yep.
So again, the hypocrisy is actually on both sides.
Sure.
You've got a Republican Chippendale supporting the establishment of a DNA database based on people who are arrested, yet at the same time literally willing to tie himself to a rail line to make sure that you don't have a gun registry. Yet at the same time you have social and the allegedly progressive Democrats willing to look the other way when legislative grants are dispersed to hockey alumni associations. And then on the other side, we've got people being shown the door at public meetings. And again, the outrage is so incredibly selective. What's it going to take for people to shed their Kool-Aid drinking adherence to their own individual messiahs and look at the big picture in Rhode Island and understand that it's all corrupt? Everybody involved has pretty much allowed themselves to be corrupted by the process.
And I think you said it best. What needs to happen is people need to start taking this personally.
Right.
You have to take these things as a personal affront.
Right.
And in turn, you got to get up in people's grills when they do this stuff. You got to call them out.
Right. No, agreed. And probably there is no better segue to the guest we have tonight than that. So let's do a radio transition and give a big welcome to our guest in studio. And I want to preface his introduction with this sort of personal note. And I've remarked on this a couple of times, Dave. We've been doing the show for about 3 years. And one of the great parts of doing a radio show like this is that we get to meet all the people we've ever really wanted to meet. And we get to sit down and have a conversation with them. It's all, and it's we approach it that we're almost sitting in our living rooms, or maybe it's, in some cases, it's like been in our dorm room in college, and we have that conversation that we always had at 2 o'clock in the morning, and really get down to the crux of certain issues. We refer to these conversations as what we call our heroes of civil disobedience. And in the last few years, we've been privileged enough to have Stephen Brown from the ACLU on just a few months ago. We've had Ray Rickman on a couple of times. We've had attorney Bob Mann on a few times.
Fred
Ordonez from DARE. We've had folks from the Good Neighbor Fund. I mean, just across the board. Dawson Hodgson, who was a great candidate for Attorney General, and which we're going to touch on. And in a few minutes, we're going to tie that into tonight's conversation. So it is a great privilege that we have, and I will always call him, as a Methodist, the Reverend Phil West, joining us today. Phil is a retired executive director for Common Cause of Rhode Island, synonymous with the pitched battles that took place in our General Assembly and at the highest levels of Rhode Island government through the 80s and 90s into the new millennium. Retired minister, actually short-time employee of the Providence Journal. Who knew?
2 weeks.
All right. And I think...
never got your union card then.
I think really represents a unique voice in Rhode Island history and in Rhode Island current, in that he epitomizes to me what I call, and what we came up with this idea together, dignified outrage, in that he, over his entire career in assailing Rhode Island government, if you will, has managed to put a dignified, articulate, targeted, yet lethal form of outrage that has resulted in real changes in the way that Rhode Island government operates. So a big coalition welcome. Welcome to the Worldwide Coalition Network, the Reverend Phil West. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks very much for having me. It's good to be with you.
The question comes up, and it's really particularly a reflection of our little opening here. You were involved in some of the biggest ethics battles in the 80s and 90s, and yet prior to your introduction on this show, you hear about some of the shenanigans that are taking place literally this week. In the 30 years or so that you've lived here in Little Brody, because you're not a native, your clear diction gives you away every moment. All right, Do you see it coming full circle? Do you see a lot of the same problems that were in place back when you were active with the organization?
Well, they always say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So I see things happening that ring true, ring familiar, and among the most common ones are the kind of resistance to change that comes from those in power. And the difficulty of those in power recognizing that they are doing the very things that sometimes they protested when they were on the outside or at the bottom of the rank and file. So human nature is difficult to deal with sometimes, but we shouldn't be surprised. We should recognize that we have to speak clearly and try to persuade people, and then we have to organize so that the power of the people is brought to bear, because ultimately that's the only thing that those at the State House fear. It's when they are getting so many phone calls and so many letters and so many people coming in demanding attention. It works, but you have to have a lot of people who recognize what's wrong and demand that it be made right.
In your earlier career, before coming to Rhode Island, you were a minister, I believe, of the United Methodist Church?
Right.
Talk to us about your days as you self-define yourself as an activist minister and what that taught you before coming to Rhode Island.
I'm a product of the civil rights movement, and I have been committed to those who are poor, particularly in the cities. And so I went to seminary in the 60s and was involved in trying to get the Federal Voting Rights Act and Federal Civil Rights Acts passed in 1965 and 64. And then I wound up working in some tough neighborhoods in New York City and dealing with people who were shut out of the system and who had no power and who sometimes were beaten up by the police. And so I had to get involved in those things. And as I spoke out, I found that people in the head of the police department said it didn't happen. We arrested him, but there's the stories they're new stories, but they're old stories. They're the kind of stories we've been seeing out of Ferguson and out of Charleston and places where people of color have been mistreated by the police and unfairly charged. And that seems not to have gone away. But I saw those things, and I saw the struggle when I would go into the establishment, for instance, to try to get some affordable housing built. And one of my first experiences was running to a guy who had to sign off on the plans. And he kept asking for little changes. And I finally said to the architect, "What's going on?" And he said he wants a bribe. He'll never ask for it. But until we offer it, the plans are not going to get approved. And I said, "How much?" And he said 5% of the architect's commission. When I got to Rhode Island, I found out that the price tag for pay-to-play in the Dupree administration was 5% of the project cost, not 5% of the architect's commission. Wow. But after a while, you begin to recognize that when people are in power, they have opportunities to steer contracts, to direct jobs to certain people, to favor certain and disfavor other people. And when that starts to happen, then all of the public gets bled. The taxpayers get bled, but ordinary people get bled, and those who should be getting services from government are shortchanged.
So, given your history, coming up in the civil rights movement, working on the Voting Rights Act, the recent kind of excision of certain key provisions from the Voting Rights Act it must really stick in your craw that this has happened, considering the fight that you've put in. And also, you mentioned we see these things happening in Ferguson, Charlestown. This is something you've been fighting your whole life. And did you see it? Has it been an ebb and flow? Did it go down for a little while and then come back up? Or do you think this has just kind of been a constant thing?
I think it's an ebb and flow, but I do think that the election of Barack Obama has stirred some deep reservoirs of racial hatred or racial ignorance in the United States. And so groups have begun to get riled up and maybe afraid of losing what they cherish. And so we're seeing more of this domestic racist stuff like Dylan Root.
Burning of black churches.
And walking in with a gun.
Yeah.
So these things are not, they're familiar to me. I'm not surprised at them. I keep thinking that we're moving ahead, but you referenced the excision by the United States Supreme Court of a key section of the pre-clearance section of the Voting Rights Act. And that's a tragedy because it was by 5-4. And this Supreme Court has, in a number of other key ways, in terms of campaign finance, broken down laws that have been in place to protect the people for decades, or in campaign finance case, a century.
Referring to Citizens United, McCutcheon.
Citizens United, McCutcheon, and so on. And they don't, it's troubling to see it. And I think you just have to take it and go forward and say, let's keep working. Maybe there will be some new appointments, and maybe even these judges will recognize some things and change. But it's tough.
Now, before you come to Rhode Island, you retire from the ministry.
I actually hadn't retired. My wife got the job as executive director of the Women's Center of Rhode Island.
Okay.
And I followed her, but I had a sense, I was 46, and I had a sense that I wasn't supposed to look for a church position. I could have had one. I mean, my credentials were perfectly in order. But I sensed that I was supposed to look for a secular job. I've always been uncomfortable with institutions that rely too much on income from the people that they are serving. In any event, so I tried out at the Providence Journal as a copy editor, and after 2 weeks I got canned. And I didn't know what I would do. And meanwhile, we'd run into a situation with a chimney on our house where we got slapped with a warning, and the neighbor said, "Well, just give an envelope to the building inspector and everything will go away." And of course that infuriated me because I knew what that was about. And so we went up, and my son and I fixed the chimney ourselves. And then ironically, there was the ad for Common Cause. And I thought I'd go there and I'd see, have a researcher and an office manager and computers. And of course there was nothing. And the executive director had no staff, and the salary was $19,500. But I accepted.
What year was this?
This was 1988.
Okay.
And you were a member of the Common Cause much earlier in your career. I
had actually joined in 1970 when John Gardner first said everybody's organized but the people. And so I joined Common Cause then. I was at a meeting in Washington first week of June, and they were going around this room with the whole national governing board and staff, and it turned out I was the earliest one to join the organization of anybody in the room. It was wonderful. I loved it. But in any event, I joined, but my membership had lapsed. But then I saw this ad, and I said, I know what that's about. And so I submitted a resume, and I went, and of course the job description said you have to have a thorough knowledge of the history and government of Rhode Island. And I had neither of those because I was from Connecticut.
It's probably better off that you didn't.
But I got the job, and the very first thing that I was asked to do was to write an ethics complaint against Governor Ed DePrete. And some revelations had been in the paper by good investigative reporters. And fortunately, Ray Condon, who had been the director of the Conflict of Interest Commission for 10 years, was on the board, and she said, I'll be your tutor. I'll show you how to do this. You can do it. And you'll learn the ethics code in the process. And I did. And it took 3 years before DePrete was found to have steered contracts to large campaign contributors and to a crony of his, Jim Taft, from Cranston. And then came the RISD crisis. So it was like I was learning first executive branch corruption, then legislative corruption in RISD, which was the legislature up to its neck, and then later the judicial corruption, and then finally the separation of powers. So it was a great learning experience for me.
Before the break, we've only got a minute or so before the break, but I'd like you to talk about the influence of Archibald Cox on your career.
Yes. Well, of course, I had admired him from afar.
And jump in for a second. Explain to some of our younger listeners who Archibald Cox was.
When Richard Nixon condoned the Watergate break-in, there was a struggle about how he would be prosecuted. And there was an agreement with Congress and the president. And it was interesting. It was a bipartisan agreement. The Republicans and Democrats both agreed something wrong had happened. They appointed Archibald Cox. He only accepted, he was a Harvard law professor. He only accepted it with the proviso that he could follow the evidence wherever it went. I don't want to run into your break, though. Am I?
No, keep going.
Okay. So he came here on the 20th anniversary and spoke to a group at Bristol Harbor about what happened, because once they recognized that tapes had been made in the Oval Office, that they should subpoena those. And he said to people, how do you subpoena the President of the United States? Who do you take to the White House door? The Marines? The President has the Secret Service. Anyway, Archibald Cox was the national chairman of Common Cause when I started. And he, before we could submit this complaint against Edward DePreet, the governor of Rhode Island, I had to send the draft by express mail to Washington. Archie Cox read it, made a few comments about it, sent it back, and said, go ahead and file it. But he was a wonderful guy who died a few years ago.
Excellent. You know, do you still have that manuscript?
Of the text?
Yeah.
Probably somewhere.
That it would be something worth saying. You are listening to the Reverend Phil West, retired Executive Director of Common Cause of Rhode Island. And, of course, you're listening to him on the Worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradio.us, on the Facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. We blog, we write, we stream. It's all there. Again, new blog post this week from our favorite architect, David Broussard, architectural writer, and, of course, the incomparable Bella Robinson. We'll be right back.
Need a vacation but don't have the funds? Don't worry yourselves. Just stop by Halfway Tree Authentic Jamaican Cuisine for a quick trip to the islands. Enjoy some authentic Jamaican food from Halfway Tree, named Best of Rhode Island by Rhode Island Monthly Magazine. Plus, every Saturday, it's New England's #1 weekly Caribbean party with Paul Michael. Halfway Tree is located in downtown Providence at 150 Chestnut Street. Visit us online at halfwaytreeri.com. Halfway Tree is Rhode Island's leading source for authentic Jamaican food and vibes.
Superstar vapor pens have arrived. These 3-in-1 vapes come equipped with dry liquid atomizers, which allow them to vaporize a variety of blends, such as e-liquids, dry herbs, and CBD oils. The unit is rechargeable from any outlet, computer, or vehicle. Whatever your smoking pleasure, visit superstarvaporpens.com to see the latest products, e-liquids, and special offers. Become a premium e-liquid club member and get discounts, free shipping, and exclusive access to new products. Get the best. Superstar Vapor Pens. Superstarvaporpens.com, or find them on Facebook and Twitter.
Beacon Shipping Logistics will ship any car, any vehicle, anywhere in the United States with door-to-door service. Just call 855-3-SHIP-IT. They ship vehicles for thousands of auto dealers throughout the country, so you know you can trust them to provide the most reliable auto transport in the industry. And they offer open or enclosed shipping for your precious cargo. Did you see a car online and can't get there? Let Beacon Shipping ship and deliver it right to your door. Need to get your boat from West Palm to Warwick Neck? Beacon can do it. Call Beacon Shipping Logistics for transporting one car to an entire fleet. Call 855-3-SHIP-IT or beaconshippinglogistics.com for service that shines. Let Beacon Shipping Logistics take the stress out of your life. Beacon Shipping Logistics provides the most honest auto transport service in the industry. Beacon Shipping Logistics, your one source for transporting one car or a whole fleet. Call 855-374-4748 for a free quote or beaconshippinglogistics.com.
And yes, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage, porn-free, civilly disobedient. Still, in fact, I think we're going to put a reward out for someone who can find the First Amendment somewhere in the great city of Cranston, Rhode Island. Joining us today is, of course, the Reverend Phil West, retired Executive Director of Common Cause. You can find us on Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio and the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, where the events of the week are fully documented. Reverend West, welcome back to the coalition.
Please call me Phil, Pat.
He's a devout Methodist. I don't think he has a choice.
Now listen, the kids on my street call me Phil, and they're like 7 years old.
11 years as an altar boy in the Catholic Church, raising my kids Methodist. It's great.
The same way that I run into my old teachers and they say, "Oh, please call me Bob," and no, you'll always be Mr. O'Brien.
I have to tell you, when Archibald Cox said, "Call me Archie," that was hard.
Yeah,
but it was an important thing for me to do.
Well, when somebody asks you and they prefer it that way, I think you kind of have to be obliged.
How's that, Pat?
All right, Phil. All right, let's talk. Let's get right into it. Let's talk a little bit about the book. First of all, if you haven't seen it excerpted in the GoLocalProb.com, a great place to get a little bit of information on the book itself is, of course, the website secretsandscandals.com. You can find all about it. This book is a must-read. I am about halfway through it. It is if you're a political person, or let's just say if you've been a sentient human being in Rhode Island in the last 15 years, you have to read this book because everything is in there. It is almost biblical in nature.
Actually, though, Pat, everything is not in there. I had to leave a lot of stuff out.
Oh, boy.
But
my God.
Is there an unrated version going to hit pay-per-view?
We were at the point where we were thinking we were going to have to go to 2 volumes, and I said, we can't do that.
Oh, for the love of God.
So, I mean, the whole traffic court scandal is not in there.
That's right. It's not. Wow.
Hey, what's 40 million amongst friends? And whatever happened, I mean, all right, let's take that just for a second. I mean, that guy Leo Scanlon, I mean, he can't, whatever happened to him after that? Oh, that's right, he's the executive director for the Speaker of the House of the state of Rhode Island.
That's right.
Yeah.
No revolving door here. But getting back to
Well, it's a revolving door from their offices to courthouses and prisons.
And then back. Don't cry for me, Gordon Fox. He will be back. The book is remarkable. The book starts out in the earliest days of your tenure here as a citizen of Little Rhody. We talked a little bit about the intro, how you were looking for a job, and as Providence would have it, literally, you came together with Common Cause. Now, again, talk about Common Cause as an operation at that time, how it had several executive directors, hardworking folks, I'm sure, but it had gone through a little bit of its own revolving door. It was a very basic operation, and yet you managed to bring it, you and Ray Condon, who you talk about effusively in the book, and her role in really steering you through. That parallels really the rise of the quote-unquote ethics commission in this state, and the history of the two of them are really inseparable. So give us a snapshot of Little Rhody back in those days. It was kind of a toddling town, wasn't it?
It was a problem. I mean, people didn't know in the 80s about the RISDIC thing, and probably a lot of your listeners don't. Some of my students, one of them said to me, "Oh, that RISDIC. I was only 8 years old, so I really don't remember." My mother
stole my newspaper route money.
He said my mother was just crazy about that because all of her money was tied up. She was a single mother or divorced. But so RISDIC was the legislature's protection of Rhode Island's homegrown credit unions. When we came here and tried to get a mortgage, a realtor took us to what was then the East Providence Credit Union. And my wife looked at, she's smarter than I am, she looked at the sign on the door, it's RASDIC, what is this? She said, what about FDIC? And Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And he said, oh, this is the way we do it in Rhode Island. Well, what we found out very soon was that the vice chair of the House Finance Committee, Bob Bianchini, was also the executive director of the Rhode Island Credit Union League, which was the trade association for the credit unions. And over the years, they had done a lot of things, and I like Bob, a lot of things with good intentions. But they had opened it up to commercial loans. They had there was a lot of insider stuff. There was some mob money getting laundered through some of the credit unions. And they had a report in 1986. Arlene Violet, when she was elected Attorney General, hired it was $1 a year, a retired banking executive named Bob Stitt and a guy named Charles Black. They studied and they said, this is going to collapse. This whole system is rife for failure. It has happened in Maryland and another state. And the House Finance Committee took everybody, Bob Bianchini and Peter Navola, who was the head of the RISDIC credit unions, took everybody to the Aurora Club for dinner, and they said, we got to kill this thing. And sure enough, they did. And Governor DePrete had 5 warnings that RISDIC was about to collapse, and he did nothing because he was taking money hand over fist from the RISDIC credit unions. And then it happened in the very end of
Governor 91, right?
On January 1, 1991, Bruce Sunderland was sworn in as governor. He went inside, he signed an order on ethics, and then he signed a second order that closed all the credit unions. And it was crazy. It was wild. And people couldn't get their money. A third of the people in the state were locked out of their money.
Well, 2 questions. First off, and there's a common day application to people's reaction to RISDIC collapse that we like to evoke here on the show, and I'll ask you about that in a second. But my first question is, you spin a remarkable tale about Mr. Bianchini. In the absence of a truly enabled ethics commission, an investigation was essentially thwarted that might have, in its own way, prevented the implosion of RISDIC. And if you could tell, because
or really, at least lessen the impact.
Right. It's a snapshot of really how things worked and continue to work on some levels of the state. You could tell us about that.
You're from Cumberland, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
Robert Bergeron, was the head of the Woodlawn Credit Union, and they were a member of RISDIC. And he was troubled by this and tried to persuade them to go for federal credit union insurance. So he kind of started this. Anyway, they shut it down. What I described before, they killed the bill. Frank Gashin from Cumberland was the sponsor, and there was a Senate bill as well. Bergeron filed an ethics complaint against Bob Bianchini. It was called a conflict of interest complaint at that point because it was under the old conflict of interest law before the Ethics Commission was formed. But they had to have 5 votes out of 9 to find a violation. They got 4, and so Bianchini was exonerated. But ironically, one of the members of the Ethics Commission who voted to exonerate him was Michael Morey, who was the president of the Warwick Municipal Employees Credit Union. So you talk about conflicts of interest. So we had conflicts of interest even on the commission that was supposed to be regulating ethics.
Now, at the same time, you were essentially hamstrung, or I'm sorry, your predecessors were hamstrung by the absence of any disclosure laws. I mean, these tribal proceedings took place in secret. So not only did you not know that they were going on in a sense, but you literally wouldn't know what the reaction to them was.
The law said that anybody who was accused of an ethics violation or conflict of interest, that had to be done in secret. And when we filed the complaint against Ed DePrete, the whole thing was behind closed doors. There are a couple chapters in my book where I have gone through the transcript in my own notes. And so you can see for the first time, because DePrete eventually pled guilty, and so there's no record, no judicial record of what actually happened. Well, here you can see spelled out the way that he was sending the lists, so getting the lists and indicating his preference, and all that stuff has never come out, although it's in the book. But the point was, the Ethics Commission process itself was cloaked with secrecy. If you robbed a bank, I'm looking at you. You're not a typical bank robber. But if you robbed a bank, your trial would be in open court. But if you caused the downfall of the credit union
robbed
system,
from every person in the state at the same time.
And it really did.
Yeah.
It was all behind closed doors. Tragic.
In fact, one of the anecdotes is so fascinating. You talk about a multi-part series that took roundtable conversations that took place between politicians, and I believe it might have been on public TV, with Common Cause, talking about the need to enforce ethics rules, which DePrete participated in simultaneously. Literally, you could almost argue that after the show, he went dumpster diving at Waltz. It's that kind of that ability of a Rhode Island politician to look you square in the eye and patronize you with the type of pablum that's still coming from the Raimondo administration and some of the people who followed DePrete. And yet at the same time, while it was going on, he was robbing the state blind, wasn't he?
Well, he wasn't robbing the state blind, and it's interesting. I interviewed Ed DePreet for this book.
Mm-hmm.
He friended me on LinkedIn or whatever, one of those. And so
That must have been awkward.
So I said, sure. And then I sent him an email and I said, Matt, come and interview you. I spent about 2 hours, more than 2 hours with him in his house in Cranston. I feel very sorry for him. I mean, I think he honestly doesn't believe he did anything worse than previous governors. I think he honestly doesn't believe he did anything wrong, but he did. And that's the problem.
Yeah. It's so embedded in the culture. It's in the DNA.
Yeah.
Right. Well, no worse than what anybody else did. Why am I being vilified? Why am I being brought up on charges? I mean, the last guy did X, Y, Z, and why are they coming down on me?
That's what he said.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is we've come a long way, and I don't want to be just negative about this. We've gotten a lot of laws passed because the people stood together and demanded change. We now have the strongest ethics commission in the United States, bar none, and I can talk about the details of that if you wish. Mm-hmm. Its authority affirmed by the Supreme Court in 1992 and 1993 and not undercut in that way since then, although one real problem that the legislature has been exempted through a terrible ruling in what's called the Irons decision in 2009.
Mm-hmm. A little generous.
And it is terribly frustrating to me that the leadership of the House and the Senate, both Teresa Paiva-Weed, their Senate president, and Nicholas Mattiello, the House Speaker, have refused to deal with this. And it's been now 6 years. Yeah. And so if there's anything that I hope your listeners will get riled up about and go to them, and coalition is a good name. We need a coalition to come together and say, we demand that the legislature be under this ethics commission. Yeah. Everybody from the building inspectors to the health inspectors to
all of your local officials, town city councils, mayors.
All of them are underneath the jurisdiction of the Ethics Commission. The legislature is exempted, and it's wrong. And what Common Cause, John Marion, my successor, has done very well is to document the fact that where they used to sign little statements and they say, I can't vote on this. It would go in the House or Senate Journal. Say, I can't vote on this because I have a conflict of interest. They didn't have to say what it was, but they had to say, I have a conflict. They've stopped doing it. It's dropped off the table. And so people have got to say to them, you must restore the jurisdiction of the Ethics Commission. The only way that can happen now is with an amendment that the people have to vote on. So they've got 2016 is coming up. They've got to do it in the 2016 legislative session.
Now, the media obviously plays a huge role in this. And what to me is fascinating is there is a notion now that people look back with rose-colored glasses to the 70s, 80s, and 90s and say, boy, I wish the Journal was as tough now as they were then. And after reading your book, it becomes apparent to me that there's a dichotomy, there's a split. There's two faces to the Providence Journal. Yes, there was a tremendous history in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s of investigative reporting. Many of these folks refer to the Journal as almost the AAA of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and many people went on to successful careers there. But it's clear, in looking back at the history, as you portray it, that the Providence Editorial Board, Providence Journal Editorial Board, to this day has had a split personality and has actively worked to oppose a lot of the ethics reforms that you folks tried to get in force. And that seems to be true. A lot of the issues that surrounded the Constitutional Convention and the Ethics Board itself, that they openly opposed and actually helped swing the election against some of the more stronger.
Well, actually, though, they did come out in the end for the Constitutional Convention. And Ed Acorn, who's now the editorial pages editor, when he came in 1999, we went and had lunch with him. Peter Hofstetter, our research director, and I, and we showed him a lot of stuff. And he went to work on separation of powers. And he became one of the most effective advocates you could imagine. And they've been very strong on restoring the Ethics Commission's jurisdiction.
So I'm talking back the original legislation that was sponsored back as a result of the first Constitutional Convention. I mean, it seems
you're exactly right. Back in the 80s, they opposed the Ethics Commission and a bunch of other things. And I was stunned. I wrote when I wrote the complaint against Ed DePreet, because it was it was on the street journalists who did the research and were revealing all this stuff. And here I was writing the complaint, and lo and behold, the Providence Journal editorial board said, well, the Pretas acknowledge some mistakes and vote for him. Right. And sure enough, I thought, this is crazy.
Well, again, you have this history of the Providence Journal. And I'm not here to beat up on the Journal this week, but the Journal has got a long-standing tradition of that. I mean, what I love about this is the constancy between what happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s and what's going on now. The Providence Journal had an opportunity to endorse Dawson Hodgson in the last go-around of executive roles and chose to just stay out of that completely. They had a chance to take on David Cicilline because of all the financial problems that were being buried in his, first campaign at Congress, and they chose to endorse him. It strikes me that the editorial board, tries to portray this themselves as being the grand salons of Rhode Island, yet at many times they've exhibited a real cowardice when it comes to going to bat for the people of Rhode Island.
I would say that nobody gets it right all the time. In fact, most I have a couple of places in the book where I've confessed that I've made some pretty serious mistakes along the way. I've seen serious mistakes from almost everybody else that I know, and that's the reality. You're a Methodist. You say it's the core of Christian teaching that all of us have made mistakes. We have missed the mark, and then the question is, what do you do about it when you miss the mark?
Well, there's a remarkable line in your book that speaks to real politics, yet almost in a Christian way. When you describe one of the sayings, one of the terms that you guys throw around at Common Cause was "no permanent friends, no permanent enemies."
Right.
Explain that. That's just a great line.
Well, when I went to my first meeting in Washington, and I walked into this room, nobody knew who I was. Archibald Cox was giving an award to somebody, and he was sitting over on the side, and I saw this hair slicked back, and one leg was partly missing, and I recognized it was John Stennis, the senator from Mississippi who had filibustered against all the civil rights legislation. And my mind went back to, and I said, how in the world can this organization I've joined be giving an award to John Stennis? Well, I asked Archie about it later, and he said, look, you have to understand, he did wrong things at some points, but he has been one of the leaders in pushing for federal campaign finance and federal ethics laws. And that's the reality. Nobody gets it right all the time. I much like it better. I shouldn't say that. The one person who always seemed ready to do the right thing was Senator Mike Lenahan, who died in February, from East Greenwich, who preceded Dawson Hodgson in that Senate seat. And Mike, as I think about it, almost always got it right. But almost all the rest of us get it wrong sometimes.
All right. Two roles that I want to explore. We've got 5 minutes left. And again, we're going to have you back on because I have a feeling we could do a mini-series. Getting back to the media, there exists, and it seems to be increasing at an accelerating rate, a revolving door between the media and actually government PR functions. All right.
You're right about that.
I mean, it's astonishing. The most recent was the young woman from the Associated Press who is now the communications liaison for the lieutenant governor. On one hand, given the uncertain economy surrounding the media, one can't fault folks for looking for a job and a paycheck. On the other hand, and I'll ask you a question I've asked other people, has effectively the ruling class, who I refer to as the 1% in Rhode Island, have they lawyered up by going out and hiring the media that was supposed to cover them?
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, Larry Berman, who is the chief spokesperson for the Speaker's office, was the editor of the Woonsocket Call.
My mother worked with him at the Woonsocket Call.
And Larry's a great guy. But the problem with being hired by a political official is then you've got to toe their line. And so there's compromises that occur once you're hired in that role.
I worry, though, are those compromises taking place before the hiring process begins? Have we established almost a shuttle-like mentality where now journalism is seen as a proving ground to become a member of government staff?
I think the way we usually put it on the show is are these folks, in essence, trading their journalistic integrity for access?
Well,
and where is that balance? Like, where is that line? And
the answer is I don't know where the line is, and I don't want to accuse anybody because I have worked with so many good reporters, and people I feel great sorrow that Jim Barron died, who was at the Pawtucket Times and also the Woonsocket Call, and I would see Jim just working his tail off at the State House.
Yeah.
Kathy Gregg, the State House bureau chief, who was working at the State House before I started, and she has been a great mentor, and she is tenacious about getting the facts and bringing them to the public. So I resist any kind of overview that sort of categorizes a group of people. I'd rather say there are temptations in every kind of office, in every kind of role that we can, every kind of institution, and we all need to be aware, and we need to look at ourselves and make sure that we're not getting seduced.
The theme show, our theme, is civil disobedience. And I want to close with this question. We pointed out early on that the behavior of members of Black Lives Matter here in Rhode Island, when they quote-unquote closed I-95, directly paralleled some of the same behavior that RISD protesters engaged in and were celebrated for. Yet, interestingly enough, some of my own quote-unquote patriot friends were ready to call on the
bring in the National Guard
and the Homeland Security, all right, and the Patriots Act, invoke that upon these people who engage in active civil disobedience. What, in your mind, is an appropriate level of civil disobedience if you are a minority or if you are an infringed upon individual here in the state of Rhode Island?
That's a really good question, Pat, and I'm not sure that I can answer it. But your comparison, because I remember when those RISD demonstrators, they didn't actually get to 95; they were just on the ramp. And the police cars came from every direction, and most of them were in their 60s, and they were mostly white, and some of them were veterans and had American Legion hats on. Wow, that's a tough question. But I think that the point is that all of us have a responsibility to pay attention to the injustices wherever they occur, and if everybody would pay attention, then there would be less desperation.
Wow.
Let's give them another plug, secretsandscandals.com, right, if you want to check out Phil's book.
It's available on the east side and a number of independent bookstores in Providence.
Almost all the bookstores in the Symposium, Island Books, Wakefield Books, Barnes & Noble. So
it's a must read. You once you start, if you've got a 4 or 5 hour plane ride in front of you, grab the book because you won't put it down. Folks, you've been listening to the Coalition on coalitionradio.us. Find us on Facebook.com/The Coalition. We'll be podcasting this on coalitionradio.us, at the Mighty Mighty Twitter, at Coalition_radio. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have Phil West in again in a few weeks to continue the conversation. Have a great week.
5-hour tea with caffeine from green tea leaves. It's delicious, energizing, and comes in 3 amazing flavors. With 0 sugar and 4 calories, it fits your life. With its compact size and portability, it goes where you go, to the campsite, the hiking trail, the beach, without weighing you down. 5-hour tea, caffeine from green tea leaves. Release your natural side. From the makers of 5-Hour Energy. For more information, visit 5hourenergy.com.